Charlottesville Inside Out is made possible thanks in part to its patrons, committed to supporting the people, places, and quality of life that uniquely define Charlottesville and its surroundings, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The 2011 National Medal of Arts to Rita Dove for her contributions to American letters and her service as Poet Laureate of the United States from 1993 to 1995.
Our guest today is a writer, educator, dancer, and former U.S. and Virginia Poet Laureate. She has won numerous awards, including a Pulitzer Prize. Join us as we sit down for a special interview with Charlottesville resident Rita Dove. Come on. You are the author of at least 10 collections of poetry, a book of short stories, a novel, a play, essays, and you're an editor. So I want to go back to the beginning and ask you about your passion for reading, because I believe I've heard you say that it all started there.
It absolutely started with reading. I can't remember a time when I wasn't curled up with a book, actually. From the very moment that I could open a book, before I could read, I knew that there was something very special going on in the world. You know, it was just the fact that you could open a book and be any place you wanted to be at that moment. It seemed like the best deal in the world. Talk about deals. So it started there. And when I started reading, finally putting together, words and things like that, it felt like I was stepping out like word for word in an adventure. When I began to really read, not picture books, but books which had chapters in them, that's when I started writing as well. Because it just seemed natural. It seemed like, okay, there's a story, someone goes on an adventure, it was usually a boy, it was usually a white boy, but okay. And so then I would write these stories if there was a black girl going off on an adventure, because obviously I was going to talk back at this book. I didn't think of it at that time as something aggressive. It was simply, this is my story, I'm going to do this too. And I could. I had a pencil, I had paper. It was a game. It was something that was expensive, and I think that's where it all started.
And you wrote a novel in the 4th grade using your spelling words?
Yeah.
Every week?
Well,
a spelling word. But you didn't realize, talk about what it was that made you realize that this could actually be a profession.
No, I didn't realize it could be a profession. It seemed like something I did to pass time. And it was fun to do. But I had no role models for becoming a writer. Writers existed between the pages of books, and what I was doing was simply playing around. And it wasn't actually until I was in high school. My English teacher in my 11th grade and 12th grade, Miss Oshner, was truly phenomenal. She was not a writer. She was in fact a 19th century, early 20th century British novel lover, but she made us also love it. And what she did, without my ever telling her that I wrote, she arranged for a few of us to go off to a book signing by an author who had come into town, to Akron, Ohio, and got permission from our parents and took us all out on a Saturday to a book signing of John Charty. And John Charty was at that point, he's a poet, but he was also at that point, he was translating the Inferno by Dante's Inferno, which I had never heard of at that age, but hey, there were books in front of him that had his name on them. And he talked about this translation and he signed them, and I looked at this man and I thought, he's alive.
Yeah, he's not. Yeah.
He wrote these things, and that's when it began to dawn on me.
Yeah. And then fast forward to 1987, you're 35?
Mm-hmm, 34, yeah.
You win the Pulitzer Prize? Can you describe that moment, that day? It was Fred's birthday.
It was Fred's birthday.
Your husband Fred's birthday.
It was his birthday. I was planning a surprise birthday party because he hates parties. And so I thought a surprise one. It was a little one. But our daughter, who was at that time in preschool, she was in on it. So it was all of this kind of stuff. And truly, I had no idea. And I had no idea I was even up for it. It was not at all on my horizon, which is maybe the best way for anything to happen. When I got a phone call from my English department chair, I was teaching at Arizona State at the time, and he knew that it was I wasn't teaching that day and that we were having the surprise birthday party, so I was a little bit miffed, and I said, why is he bothering me? I've got all this stuff to do. And he said, you got a Pulitzer, and then there was this comic back and forth. Now I think of it as I said no, and he said yes. I said no, and we went back and forth. And I noticed his voice was a little higher than usual, and I thought maybe he's not kidding me. And it just, that was it.
Did it change your life as you knew it?
Yes,
good,
absolutely.
bad, a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. Good. Most of it was good. The bad part was only because I think it was. And many people will tell you this if they've had, any kind of brush with the limelight, is that the negotiating, trying to be a private person and being a public person is a learning curve. Yeah. And I grew up, I was very shy as a child. I've always been shy. You just have to just get over it. There's a point where you just kind of.
I feel that you've reached that point.
Well, well, anyway, but that was a big step. I just thought, oh my God, he said, I've arranged a press conference. I did not know what a press conference, how to do one. And I said, I don't know how to do this. And he said, you'll learn. And he hung up.
And he hung up.
And I think that you learn has really helped me too over the years. Whenever I hit something that I've not done before, like being poet laureate, I just think you'll learn, just pay attention. You've been a student before, you can do this, and kind of go step by step. So yeah.
I love that. Tell us about Thomas and Beulah, because this is the collection of poetry.
This is the one that got the Pulitzer, and I really felt that when I was writing those poems, I felt completely out there alone on my own adventure. I won't bore you with all the details, but at that point in time, I had had 2 books of poems out. Most poetry in the United States at that time, there was a real trend for lyric poems, short personal poems, and the idea of writing a book of poems which told a story, I thought it was just going to be skewered, in the press. But it was the story I had to write. It was a story about my grandparents. My grandmother had told me stories about my grandfather when he was young. This was after he had died, and I was a teenager at that time when she told me these stories. What continued to shock me at that time, and it continued to haunt me, was that I had never thought of him as a young man. I thought of him as my grandfather.
Right,
what kid
right.
doesn't, But then I suddenly thought, my gosh, he was 20 once. He played the mandolin. He did all this stuff that he never talked about. He was my grandfather. And I wanted to discover who that man was. So that started the journey, poem by poem. And then some poems came in where my grandmother was like, hey, I got a side too. And that's when I realized it was a whole book. So I wrote the book thinking it was really a recovery of lives that I felt that I had lost doubly, because not only, because they were both deceased at that point, but because I had not known who they had been. And I just thought, well, okay, if people hate it, I don't care, because I need to tell the story.
Yeah, and clearly they didn't hate it.
They didn't hate it, no.
Clearly. Would
no.
you read a few of those?
Sure.
A few poems
Sure.
from.
This is the very first poem in the volume. It's the story that my grandmother told me, basically. It's the one that set me off on this adventure about what happened with my grandfather when he was coming north. Was a young man as part of a song and dance team traveling on a riverboat up the Mississippi. The event. Ever since they'd left the Tennessee Ridge with nothing to boast of but good looks and a mandolin. The two Negroes leaning on the rail of a riverboat were inseparable. Lem plucked to Thomas's silver falsetto. But the night was hot, and they were drunk. They spat where the wheel churned mud and moonlight. They called to the tarantulas down among the bananas to come out and dance. "You're so fine and mighty. Let's see what you can do," said Thomas, pointing to a tree-capped island. Lem stripped, spoke easy. "Them's chestnuts, I believe." Dove quick as a gasp. Thomas, dry on deck, saw the green crown shake as the island slipped under, dissolved in the thickening stream. At his feet, a stinking circle of rags, the half-shell mandolin. Where the wheel turned, the water gently shirred. So, that was the story my grandmother told me. I remember as a teenager saying, "What do you mean the island just slipped on? That doesn't make any sense," teenagers. And she just said, "That's my story, I'm sticking to it. That's, that's what happened." He climbed that tree, the island disappeared and sunk, and his friend died. And that's why he ended up coming alone to Ohio, Akron, Ohio. That's why he decided to settle down and met my grandmother.
Read Courtship.
Read Courtship.
Please.
It's in two parts. Courtship. 1. Fine evening, may I have the pleasure? Up and down the block, waiting for what? A magnolia breeze, someone to trot out the stars? But she won't set a foot in his turtle dove Nash. It wasn't proper. Her pleated skirt fans softly, a circlet of arrows. King of the crawfish in his yellow scarf, mandolin belly pressed tight to his houndstooth vest, his wrist flicks for the pleats, all in a row, sighing. 2. So he wraps the yellow silk, still warm from his throat, around her shoulders. He made good money. He could buy another. A gnat flies in his eye, and she thinks he's crying. Then the parlor festooned like a ship, and Thomas twirling his hat in his hands, wondering, how did I get here? China pugs guarding a fringed settee where a father, half Cherokee, smokes and frowns. I'll give her a good life. What was he doing? Selling all for a song? His heart fluttering shut, then slowly opening. He got caught. That feeling. There's a little aside to that poem because that original scarf was blue. And when I was writing the poem, I changed it to yellow because I wanted to melt as opposed to the blue. So I did tell my mother, she was the only person who knew what facts were true or not.
Oh, that's nice. That's great. Now let's read Sunday Greens and talk a little bit about Beulah's point of view, because hers is very different too. She didn't always entirely enjoy being domestic and being a mother and a wife.
My grandmother was a force of a woman. She, when she walked in the room, everyone paid attention. That's why I remember her. And so when I was working on the poems I dealt from her point of view, I realized that though the marriage was a very happy marriage, I'm trying to find the poem, but I'll find it eventually.
154.
Thank you.
I thought I marked them, but I might.
There it is. Okay. So, but she was also a person of her time. She was kind of caught in that time. She'd had to do things like this. And Sunday Greens are something that anyone who's made them from scratch, this is quite labor intensive. From the washing of them to just the cooking down of them, before pressure cookers and things like that. This took a long time. So, Sunday Greens. She wants to hear wine pouring. She wants to taste change. She wants pride to roar through the kitchen till it shines like straw, She wants lean to replace tradition. Ham knocks in the pot, nothing but bones, each with its bracelet of flesh. The house stinks like a zoo in summer, while upstairs her man sleeps on. Robe slung over her arm and the cradled hymnal, she pauses, remembers her mother in a slip, lost in blues, and those collards, wild-eared, singing.
So tell us about your process. I know you're a night owl. I know you would prefer to start at midnight and maybe end at 6.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and if it's changed over the years as you've been.
It's gotten worse. Well, actually, when I was growing up and when I went through school and in the early years as a poet, I was a night owl who was struggling very mightily not to be one. So that meant that I would try to go to bed by 3. I would try. No, seriously, it was an effort. Even when I was a child, I still remember finally getting a little transistor radio because my parents couldn't get me to sleep. I would be in bed, but I would just toss and turn and toss and turn. And finally I got this little transistor radio so I could at least listen to something while I was awake. So I spent a lot of my adolescence and in early adulthood being tired and trying to do like everyone else. And I was in college when I finally had a professor who said, write whenever you feel the most alive. Think about your life, and that's when you write. And I thought, hey, why am I trying to be a morning person when obviously I'm not? So that's when it started. It's gotten much worse because now I'm able to adjust my schedule. So for instance, last night I went to bed at, I think it was about 7. This morning, actually. I went to bed at 7. I said, I have to get to bed. I have to. But I do not know why. That's the way I'm wired. Luckily, my husband, Fred, is also that way. And he needs less sleep than I need, so he can stay up even later or earlier as you choose. But it's wonderful. At midnight, I just start to come alive.
So the two of you are rattling around together at 6, 5 in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yes, we are. But so that's part of the process, just finding out when I felt like the most energy flowing. And that it does help with the writing, I mean, exponentially, when I can do that. Of course, I'll do it other times too, but it might take a little longer. I tend to work, it's a very strange process. I think a lot of people will try to write from beginning to end, and very often I'll start in the middle of a poem. I don't know why. I'm not going to question the muse. Do not question the muse. That's the first rule. I just know that sometimes I know when a line will come in my head or a couple words, and I know that they belong in the middle of the poem. Go figure. But I work in fragments. So that means that, I might have the middle of a poem ready or the last third, and only glimmers of the beginning. And so it has to stay in that state for a while. So I'll work on several poems at once.
I read somewhere that you have different colored folders.
I do.
You instead of putting little titles on the folders so that you don't pigeonhole them.
Right.
But they're more of a mood?
Well, it's this, I think that while I'm writing, if I don't learn something new while I'm writing, if I don't discover something about myself or about emotion, anything, then how would I expect my readers to be, excited about anything? So I really feel that there is a notion of discovery, of a journey, of adventure in the writing of a poem. That means that if it's in a amorphous state, if it's in this state where I'm not quite sure where it's not done yet, to put a title on it or to say this is a war poem or this is a love poem puts a cage around it in an interesting way until it's done. So color is maybe just a gentler way of going about it, and I do love color. I've always loved colors. So I'll put it in a blue folder. And then if I go back to work, because I will go and work regularly to write, whether I have an idea in my head or not. That's another thing, the notion that, I mean, inspiration, yes, that's wonderful. But inspiration also hides. You know, inspiration
Yes.
will,
Yes.
I mean, who wouldn't rather be sitting out under a tree, you know, with a mint julep? You know, but once I start working, sometimes inspiration comes up. So I'll sit down to write, whether I have an idea or not. And sometimes I'll just go to the folders and say, I feel like green today. I just feel green. And then I pull out the green folder. But I think what I'm doing also is kind of tapping into a mood or tapping into some emotional state that I don't want to name yet or pigeonhole.
Yeah.
And then I go. And poems do change their folders. They
like
do.
that. They
They
change
do.
their folders.
Yeah, sometimes they skip over to another color.
Well, and clearly history is something that you enjoy, including it's part of your writing, and music. Music is a part of you. Talk about this and what music means to your writing and to you as an individual.
Wow. I can't imagine writing without music. This is it. I grew up with both of them simultaneously. First through just always hearing music in the house, and it could be anything. It could be, my father would, like on Saturday mornings, he would come down and put on something on the stereo, and we would judge his mood by the music. You know, if it was a Corelli flute sonata, you go, okay, I don't know, we've got to tread. Or it could be Josh White, or it could be, so it was all over the board. I started playing the cello when I was in 5th grade, when I was 10, 11. And through wonderful, you know, music in the schools program. First the little, you know, those guys, the little flutes, the little, and then they asked who wanted to learn an instrument. And I chose the cello because it sounded good, which should have told me something about where I was really headed in life. But I didn't know what it was. I knew it was a string instrument, but cello, fine. Everyone else was doing violin. So I went the other way, took this cello, and I said, oh my gosh, what have I done? But I loved it. And there was a point where I really wanted to become a classical musician, but the thought of being in front of an audience, I mean, my knee would shake, and it's not good if you're a cellist, if your knee shakes. So yeah. I remember thinking about that, and I thought, well, I didn't want to be in an orchestra because orchestras are, you know, it's a hard life. You know. Well, anyway, so music. I remember at one point, my husband was teaching at Oberlin College, and I went to the conservatory to ask if I could take lessons. I was so naive to think I could just walk in there and say, I like to play cello. And, but as luck would have it, the cellist, the main cellist, who was the principal cellist of the Cleveland Symphony, actually, Katharina Mainz, happened to be coming through the lobby as I was trying to convince this person that I really wanted to take cello lessons. And she said, are you up for a new instrument? And I said, what is it? And she said, it's a viola da gamba, which is an early string instrument. And I said, sure, because I just needed music. I'd always loved to sing, but it wasn't there anymore. And I began to panic. Oh my God, motherhood, I've lost everything, I'm too old. And I thought, I'm losing the voice that I didn't even use. And that's when I started taking voice lessons. Because a voice you can carry around with you anywhere. Try to think that love's not around. Still it's uncomfortably near. My old heart ain't gaining no ground because my angel eyes ain't here.
Speaking of music, so tell us about this.
This is the book that I felt like it was, I had been fated to write. I had been moving toward all along and didn't know. This is a story of, it's a real story of a prodigy violinist, mixed race, from the time of about Beethoven. And his father was African, or at least he said he was African. You don't know how much of an African he was. And his mother was from what is now Poland. But the story, the real wonderful part about it is that Beethoven had composed a sonata for him and that he had premiered it. And the sonata is the Kreutzer Sonata, which we know as the Kreutzer Sonata, named after another violinist, a French violinist, but not this one. But so I began to look him up and to wonder, well, what, how is it that we don't know about him? How did he drop out of history? And that's ended up to be that book. As I researched him, found out stuff about him, and what it was also like to be mixed race in London, in Austria, and to be so talented at that time.
And Beethoven, well,
yeah.
Read the Bridge Tower.
I'll read you, yes, this is the first poem. It's called The Bridge Tower. His name was George Bridgetower, and well, I'll read it and then I'll tell you why it's the first poem, okay? The Bridge Tower. If was at the beginning. If he had been older, if he hadn't been dark, brown eyes ablaze in that remarkable face, if he had not been so gifted, so young a genius with no time to grow up, if he hadn't grown up, undistinguished to an obscure old age, if the piece had actually been, as Kreutzer exclaimed, unplayable, even after our man had played it, and for years no one else was able to follow, so that the composer's fury would have raged for naught, and wagging tongues could keep alive the original dedication from the title page he shredded. Oh, if only Ludwig had been better looking, or cleaner, or a real aristocrat, von instead of the unexceptional van from some Dutch farmer. If his ears had not already begun to squeal and whistle, if he hadn't drunk his wine from lead cups, if he could have found true love, then the story would have held. In 1803, George Polgreen Bridgetower, son of Friedrich Augustus, the African prince, and Maria Anna Sovinki of Beulah in Poland, traveled from London to Vienna, where he met the great master, who would stop work on his third symphony to write a sonata for his new friend to premiere triumphantly on May 24th, whereupon the composer himself leapt up from the piano to embrace his lunatic mulatto. Who knows what would have followed? They might have palled around some, just a couple of wild and crazy guys strutting the town like rock stars, hitting the bars for a few beers, a few laughs, instead of falling out over a girl nobody remembers, nobody knows. Then this bright-skinned papa's boy could have sailed his 15-minute fame straight into the record books, where instead of a Regina Carter or Aaron Dworkin or Boyd Tinsley sprinkled here and there, we would find rafts of black kids scratching out scales on their matchbox violins so that someday they might play the impossible. Beethoven's Sonata No. 9 in A major, Opus 47, also known as the Bridge Tower. So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I had just decided that once I had learned more about him, I thought it is not about the story. It's not about just what happened, in his life that he ends up meeting Beethoven. It's about how he feels. It's about what life is really about. Because when we walk through our lives, we're not thinking, oh, I'm going across the street and there I will meet so-and-so and then we'll do. You're not thinking about goals and objectives all the time. We're going down the street, we meet someone, we say hi, we see a flower, we feel the breeze. So that's what I wanted to convey. So I got the story out of the way, at the beginning.
But, actually, and will you also read Disappearance?
Yes, I'll read Disappearance. This is when he's very young, as a 10-year-old playing. And I should say, because this is a visual poem as well, there are two sides of it. On the right-hand side are the stage directions. Okay, I'll read them too. Disappearance. Kill the lights. Cut the atmo. A boy and his violin. That's it. The one tucked into the side of the other, both small, unremarkable. No, 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 no. Add the pink gel. Until one of them moves. The boy lifts his arm or the violin floats up to kiss his chin. Spot number 8 now, a whisper of gold. Grow it and fade the pink on my count. 5, 4, 3, slowly, slowly. Drown the 4 stage, let it seep in. A man can vanish between the downstroke and the first note's sigh. From one word to the next, a wink and a nod. He'll evaporate under a lady's gaze as her smile slides across the room. Do we want fog machines here? A little much, maybe, but spill some purple along the boards and back, then lift it up the scrim like a rising curtain of melancholy, an aurora borealis of the soul. I know, that sucked. You get the drift. But a boy looks out from the backs of his eyes. A boy stays where you put him, invisible, until you hiccup. Full floods on my mark. Go. And suddenly, he's there. It's that thinking. You asked earlier about the difference, what happens, when the Pulitzer happened, and I had noticed too, there's this need or desire that brought you to that point. For this little boy, it was music. For me, it was poetry. And then comes the next step where the public comes to meet you and you get mic'd, and you have lights, and you have to think about all that too in order to make it come across. And that's why I kind of broke that poem up like that.
Yeah. And it didn't work out so well in the end for him.
It didn't work out so well. I mean, it did. We don't know. I mean, he lived a long time. He was 80 when he died, but he did die unremarked, unknown. And he had his moment of fame. Beethoven had destroyed the dedication. And it still remains a mystery exactly what prompted that destruction, because they were very friendly for a little while before that.
It wasn't the girl? I thought it was the girl.
It's always the girl, isn't it? No, well, you know what was interesting, because I was looking through, I looked through all sorts of stuff, and I read Beethoven's notebooks and things like that. When I said that I felt like I'd been born to write this, because I knew German, my husband is German, so I was fluent in German, I had all the classical training and then this desire. But as I was reading Beethoven's things, he sent him little notes saying, oh, let's go grab a beer. Basically, that's what he said in his kind of Austrian dialect. So they were friends. They were palling around, really. What happened? There's one photograph, one drawing, I should say, of Bridge Tower. He was really good looking. He was a fine thing. And Beethoven was not, as we know. Beethoven, we also know, was very swarthy, and people did joke and call him the Moor, and there's been, So though there's no concrete evidence, it speaks of a jealous rage, So, and they did go off to the Prater, which was the kind of the park, the amusement park that everyone went there. So I have a feeling that he probably liked someone that Beethoven liked. May I have a stand?
No choice.
You have no choice. It's a perfect rumba.
We were talking about music, but dance is also something that you love, and you're a ballroom dancer.
Yes, and you make it sound like a confession of a Playboy bunny.
I love that. I think a Playboy bunny. I didn't say that.
No, you did not.
No, but I think people have this idea that writers, and maybe even poets especially, that they are that they're in their study, that they are by themselves, that they like to be by themselves, that they're writing, and that they're solitary. But there are a lot of parts of your life that are very alive and that involve other people and music. And so ballroom dancing is something that you love to do.
It's true. And ballroom dancing happened again. You could say it's an accident. I prefer to think of it as just following something that, you know, kind of, it was a spark. And it started literally, it was a spark, because it did start in tragedy. Lightning struck our house and it burned down. And it was because our wonderful neighbors were trying to cheer us up that they invited us to a dinner dance where I saw some people dancing, waltzing, made this comment, oh, I've always wanted to do that. And our neighbor said, why not? And signed up the whole neighborhood for introductory ballroom lessons. We stuck with it, Fred and I did. It was daunting, but I also loved the fact that we were students again. To learn something completely new, to feel absolutely awkward and stupid and, you know, kind of like naked out there, that is a cleansing thing. And it was great fun. We also met a whole bunch of different people.
Oh, okay. So American Smooth.
Oh, American
Smooth. So this is so perfect segue.
American Smooth. I don't have to explain anymore what smooth dancing is, pretty much thanks to Dancing with the Stars, but you'll find out if you don't know. American Smooth. We were dancing. It must have been a foxtrot or a waltz, something romantic but requiring restraint, rise and fall, precise execution as we moved into the next song without stopping, two chests heaving above a 7-league stride. Such perfect agony one learns to smile through, ecstatic mimicry being the sine qua non of American Smooth. And because I was distracted by the effort of keeping my frame, the leftward lean, head turned just enough to gaze out past your ear and always smiling, smiling. I didn't notice how still you'd become until we had done it. For 2 measures, 4, achieved flight, that swift and serene magnificence before the earth remembered who we were and brought us down.
And I love that. Oh, I love that. Thank you.
It's really what every, I think, artistic endeavor, or anything that we do actually, and try to do well, what it's about. You don't want people to see the hard work behind it. There's hard work, and then there's also magnificence, just for a moment.
In 1993,
Rita Dove was appointed Poet Laureate of the United States and consultant in poetry at the Library of Congress by President Clinton.
You were the youngest U.S. Poet Laureate, the first African-American Poet Laureate. Talk about what your role, what was expected of you, and even more so, how did you interpret that role? What did it mean to you? What did you want to accomplish in that role?
Well, again, this was something that came out of the blue. I wasn't expecting it. Up to that point, most of the poet laureates had been much older, and so it wasn't even on the horizon as something that could possibly happen. And when I was asked, I knew that though I really wanted to spend the next summer writing, I knew that I had to step up to that plate. There was no question. I did not know what my role was going to be. I did not know what I was supposed to do. So I went and I asked, this is what you do. I went to Washington and to visit beforehand, and I said, well, what are my duties? And I got a kind of a blank stare. And they said, well, you know, you planned this poetry series. So I said, is that all? There was no answer. But people began to write me letters. They found out when the announcement was made, people wrote letters. That was when people wrote letters. And they basically told me. They told me what to do, not in a bossy way, but it was sort of like, there were so many confessions. People would say things like, I don't know much about poetry, but, and then they would talk about the first book of poems or the first poem that they loved, and it was incredible. This across the board, lawyers, teenagers, I mean, people from, the middle of the country and people from New York, it didn't matter. They usually apologized for not knowing anything about poetry, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then they would begin to talk passionately about something that changed their life. And I thought, what is this that people are terrified of poetry, and yet they need it so much, or it matters so much? And that, to me, was my goal. Then I had it. I mean, I needed to try to go as many places as I could, as many unusual places, not just university, podia, but going to other kinds of places to talk about poetry, to bring it into the everyday discourse, to reduce that anxiety. And so that meant also kind of, ad-libbing. It wasn't like a set schedule. The next question I asked in Washington was what my budget was. Same blank look. And so I thought, okay, you go until they stop you. That's what you do if you don't have a budget, which is what I did.
You go until they stop you.
Yes,
I like that.
yeah.
You'll have to keep that in mind at PBS.
But that meant, doing things like going on Sesame Street, because, even before they, know how to read, put that poem out there.
Exactly.
Kids love language. We all played with it all when we were growing up. We always say, from art link letters, kids say the darndest thing, to every proud grandparent talking about what their child has said. Because when we start out, we are open to the world, and we're trying to figure it out. And this language is part of it, and we're going to put it together, and we're going to play with it. And then somewhere along the line, we get scared. And my, mission was to start chipping away at that fear.
Yeah, and in an earlier conversation with you, I said, as an educator, what is your advice to people who are intimidated by poetry? And one of your responses was that we need to teach children at a very young age not to be afraid.
Yeah. And I think the way to do that, it's simply read them a poem and don't ask them what it means. Don't ask them to weigh in on it. Just make it part of their life. It's like, here it is, boom. And send them home. At kindergarten first, start it then. And then before long, they'll be coming back saying, hey, what was that poem you said yesterday? What was that? What was that about? They'll be demanding to know more about it. But it becomes part of their life. And then there's some wonderful sites that for adults who have already been ruined, for adults who already are terrified or whatever.
Right.
There's Poetry Daily, which is actually Charlottesville local site every day, and you can subscribe to it, it's free. Every day you can just get a poem. You can decide yourself if you like this poem or not. No one's judging you, you just read it and keep going, and before long, you'll be looking forward to it.
I like that. Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay, so you received so many different awards and honors. Pages, more than I have up here. Talk about a few that have meant the most to you.
It's, well, obviously, the ones we've talked about, because they were life-changing. I think getting the National Medal of the Humanities and the National Medal of the Arts were two that really were, that meant a lot to me, because well, anytime you can have President Obama put a medal around your neck, you say, I'll take that one.
And no one else has ever won both of these. Has anyone else ever received both of these?
I know that there hasn't been another writer or poet who has. I don't know, beyond that. But so it's interesting, to get the National Medal of the Humanities, which I gotten under President Clinton, was also really wonderful to show that, not for me, but just for that poetry could be considered something that matters to the human soul. That's basically it, right? You know, that there is that connection, that it is not divorced from who we are as, you know, in our humanity. So the very fact that it was the Humanities Medal was really important.
Well, I feel that when I read your poetry, that is exactly how I feel.
Yeah.
That there is no way that it is not coming from your soul, that it isn't going to reach other people's souls. It's as lyrical and alive and playful. It's accessible, but at the same time completely over my head. And it makes me want to read it more and to hear you speak it more. So thank you. And I also want to ask you about Fred, because you're running around the country doing all of these different things. You have this most lovely husband who is also a writer, a novelist. So we have to talk a little bit about you and Fred, because there should be a poem, Me and Fred.
Me and Fred. Well, there's a couple of poems I've written about Fred, and it's just that, gosh, I wouldn't be here without him. And I don't know where I end and he begins in a certain way. I mean, Fred has been, we go everywhere together as much as we can. The only time we didn't do that was when our daughter was really tiny and you had, to figure out babysitting duties and stuff like that. But we still can miss an exit because we're talking.
Aww.
That kind of thing. So no, it's just so wonderful to have a helpmeet, as one used to say. It's a true helpmeet. Someone who is, we show each other our stuff. We have rules about that, but we do it, and it's just great. And I don't know, he's fantastic. He documents everything, so he takes pictures all the time, which I'm glad he does, even though I complain when he does it at the moment, but then I would have forgotten, or he would have forgotten, and then we can go back and look. So no, it's just been wonderful.
And you have a lovely daughter, and I just can't help but ask, what did her teachers think of you, the hours that you all keep as a family? Was she rattling around?
I don't know.
That hasn't worked well in our home.
Well, actually, a couple of her teachers are here today, her former teachers. And I don't know if they knew that was happening, because, well, we did try to keep her, to pay attention to how her body clock was, but when she was a really small child, she could stay up as late as she wanted to, as long as she got up the next day. Now she's an absolute morning person. She's up at 6, happy as can be.
She has her coffee, and you have...
And we go to bed.
And you have your glass of water and passing the night. All right, collaboration.
Yes.
You really enjoy collaborating and working on different projects with different people. And there is a project here in Charlottesville that you were part of, the Mural Project. Talk about that.
The Mural Project. That was so fantastic. As you know, as you can tell, I really believe in getting arts out among everyone and making them accessible. They are not something that should be put on a silver pedestal. But the Mural Project, they approached me about the notion of the idea of putting a poem on a mural, and I thought it would be a wonderful idea. It's a little scary to see your words writ large, but in the idea of stumbling across art wherever you are and how that can change your life, I was all for it. I met with the muralist. It was great. He was thinking the same way that I did, David Gwynn. We were ad-libbing. We were feeling each other out and what would look good on a wall. Here again, this is the more technical aspects. How much of a poem you can put up on a wall before people have an accident or gets
That's
too much.
True, yeah.
And so, and he was worried that I would be upset if we only put one line up, and I'm like, no, you can't put the whole poem up there. We'll put it around the corner at eye level. He did such an amazing job. I think it's a beautiful mural. I've had people write me and tell me about that. And I like the idea that you can be coming right over that little hill and just see this one line the world, you know, and wonder, what was that about? I would be remiss if I didn't leave you with a poem. It is called Testimonial, and thanks to the Charlottesville Mural Project, it is scheduled to become part of the local urban scenery as a public work of art. So when, in years to come, you return to grounds as alumni, you can stroll down to the corner and find these words painted on the side of the Graduate Hotel, 6 stories high. Back when the earth was new and heaven just a whisper, back when the names of things hadn't had time to stick, back when the smallest breezes melted summer into autumn, when all the poplars quivered sweetly in rank and file, the world called and I answered. Each glance ignited to a gaze. I caught my breath and called that life, swooned between spoonfuls of lemon sorbet. I was pirouette and flourish, I was filigree and flame. How could I count my blessings when I didn't know their names? Back when everything was still to come, luck leaked out everywhere. I gave my promise to the world, and the world followed me here.
I love that. Oh, I love that. Thank you. Thank you. I have 10 more questions I'd like to ask, but I would like to ask you about 2017 in Charlottesville. Was a rough year, very difficult time. As a member of our community, as an educator at the University of Virginia, as a writer and an artist, how do you think through the arts we can heal and move forward?
What the arts do for us, one of the things I think the arts do for us, is to remind us almost on a cellular level that we are connected, regardless of our skin color, our differences, our genders, our culture, our class, that we are all human beings on this planet. And if we cannot make this work together, then we will destroy one another. The arts, with very little money, you know, with very little kind of brouhaha, can unify us and uplift us. I talked earlier about reading and how reading can make you feel like, I can go anywhere and do anything. They do that with very little kind of resources. One of the things that happens, I think we have been through a very rough year where you wonder, do we know ourselves? Who are we? How do we talk to one another? Communication is more difficult than people imagine. If we're talking, we are going to say something that someone else will take offense to because they're bringing their own baggage to it. The arts, if we can all enjoy something together, read it, understand it, link to it, hear it, then we begin to trust one another. Because you say, well, that person can't be that bad if they like that song, right? If we can dance to that together, hey, maybe we can do something else together. If we like this poem together, or if we look at that, you know, that painting and both of us are standing there lost in thought, maybe we can turn to one another. That's what the arts does on one level. And I think that many people are looking to, particularly the writers, for, you know, kind of help, get to articulate the helplessness we felt about that whole event, and the pain and the misery. And I think that many writers are starting to do that. But it's not just the writers; it's the musicians and the artists. Everyone is pitching in and doing this too. This is what the arts can do to help heal that. And believe me, we're all working on it.
Will you read a poem that you feel?
Yeah, this is a. You asked me, you know, about reading a poem to end with, and I thought that given where we all stand, I must say that I am so happy to be a Charlottesvillian. This is an amazing place. It is one of the reasons, because it's such a warm and promising and exciting town. I think it's one of the reasons why we were targeted, basically. But this is a poem about what we can do every day of our lives. Dawn Revisited. Imagine you wake up with a second chance. The blue jay hawks his pretty wares, and the oak still stands, spreading glorious shade. If you don't look back, the future never happens. How good to rise in sunlight, in the prodigal smell of biscuits, eggs and sausage on the grill. The whole sky is yours to write on, blown open to a blank page. Come on, shake a leg. You'll never know who's down there frying those eggs if you don't get up and see.
Yes.
So, really, thank you.
Charlottesville Inside Out is made possible thanks in part to its patrons, committed to supporting the people, places, and quality of life that uniquely define Charlottesville and its surroundings, and by viewers like you. Thank you.